We're entering a new age in Formula One where McLaren is firmly back in the picture, competing for wins, maybe fighting for championships, maybe not this year, we'll see. But they are making their name known across the Formula One world again. This is Turn One. We're your host, Thomas.
And Jeremiah.
We are going to go through the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, also known as Imola, from this past weekend. We're going to go through the practice and the quality. We're going to quick hit some things throughout the race, like the battles and the strategy. But of course, we're going to dive into the epic 15-lap battle at the end between young Lando Norris and three-time world champion Max Verstappen. So stick around for that. We'll have the timestamps below if you want to jump ahead. Where I want to start, though, is probably the most interesting note outside of the F1, race itself. I think Max Verstappen had the craziest race weekend of any F1 driver that we've ever seen. Can you walk me through Max Verstappen's weekend?
Max Verstappen is the only man that has, first of all, two jobs as a professional driver. But which one is his hobby is the real question here. Because one, he's just cruising to victories regularly, and the other one, he's putting serious time and focus in. But here's the thing, and we'll touch on this later. One of them is starting to get a little bit harder for him, and we'll touch on that with McLaren a little bit later. He's the only driver that, after qualifying, immediately jumps into a 4.5-hour stint in the 24 hours of the Nürburgring for his e-racing team, Redline.
Yeah, so he qualies pole, takes pole in F1, the thing that pays him like $50 million a year, proceeds to go into his motorhome at the Imola track, gets set up in a simulator, does a 2.5-hour stint, takes a nap, then does another 2-hour stint, takes a nap. He's getting ready to go out on track in pole at Imola for his F1 race. Meanwhile, the team that he just did 4.5 hours of driving for takes home the win at 24 hours of Nürburgring 15 minutes before the green flag waves at Imola.
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And it's funny because I was listening to them, obviously being funny, but his Redline team is like, yes, we're the only team that allows for our drivers to also enjoy their hobbies as they're. I was like, whoa. $50 million a year, and that's his hobby? It's ridiculous.
And I could be wrong, but I think I heard in an interview where the night before he was up streaming on Twitch for like 8 hours.
Yeah. And then he was like, I still didn't go to sleep. I watched the fights after. I don't know what fights he was watching, but I was like, geez, man.
I think he watched the Fury fight.
Oh, that's right. That's ridiculous.
So that was Max's weekend. And not to spoil it, but then he goes on to win the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Which is ridiculous. Okay, take me through. You had a note or two on qualifying, specifically around Max you wanted to bring up.
Just practice, actually, not qualifying. The only note for qualifying that I have is Sergio Perez completely botched it. Ended up in, I believe, 11th place and had to fight his way back up, which may or may not have worked out for him, honestly. It was a really rough race for him. But I want to touch on practice because in FP1 and FP2, Max was all over the place. And when I say all over the place, I mean everywhere but the track. He had no balance in that car, no comfort in that car, no trust in that car, and it was scary. I had no idea how this race was going to unfold until qualifying, where he puts it on pole.
Well, he complained about the car all weekend, and apparently his team basically rebuilt the car. Not like actually rebuilt it, but in terms of the setup, they completely redid the setup before quali in the race. So he was driving basically a new car for that race. And you could tell even during the race, he wasn't comfortable with it. His tire deg wasn't where he wanted to be. He was loose on corners. He jumped that one chicane during the race.
Yeah, he had a black and white flag like 15 laps, 10 laps or something like that into the race. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, so we're noticing some cracks, I think, in Red Bull's perfect system. Not to say that their world is falling apart, but this year alone, they've had 2 or 3 races where Max is not happy with the car, and it has led to these battles that we'll get to here in a little bit. Looking at quali, you're right. Checo, of course, one of the stories of the day where he qualies like legit in 11th place. Like that was his best showing, was coming in 11th. The other note, of course, was Alonso, who I believe ran off in practice. And then because they were already going to start in 19th, they went ahead and made changes to his car, and that put him in a pit lane start in 20th for the actual Grand Prix. your prediction, your wild card, if I remember correctly, was Daniel Ricciardo finishing in 9th, correct?
Yep.
Daniel Ricciardo qualified in 9th.
I know. And I want to give a shout out real quick because we had Nico Hulkenberg and both V carbs in Q3. They made it to the top 10. And, you know, all it took was Lance Stroll, Sergio Perez, and Fernando Alonso all not making Q3 whatsoever. But regardless, we knew if there's going to be any problems with any of the top teams that this is what was going to happen.
I got two more things for you on quality specifically. One, did you ever think you'd see the day where Yuki Tsunoda just straight up beats Lewis Hamilton?
No.
No. And two, not to go back down this rabbit hole, but last week we had the whole debate about would you pick Lewis Hamilton or Carlos Sainz right now straight up? Dude, Russell is beating him every single weekend.
Yeah, and the reason why is because I saw an interview, I believe it was with Toto, I could be wrong on that, but they're saying that Lewis is being very experimental with the car right now, just trying to, because while George is just trying to get the best result with what he's given, Lewis is trying to figure out what could be better. So he's trying out different setups that might be out of the norm to try and see what might benefit them in the long run. So he's kind of sacrificing these early races to try and have a better back end of the season. And plus, if we look at history, it always tells the same tale. And that's that the back half of the season is always Lewis's strong suit. After he's figured out the car, he's had the full first season to experiment fully, and he knows what he's got.
And Lewis did come out ahead in the race of George, so my point doesn't fully stand. But it does for qualifying, which is why I bring it up. Okay, take me through, before we get to my couple notes on the race, take me through the incredibly exciting turn one. I mean, we just had so many overtakes, so many passes, guys running off the track left and right. It was 2022 all over again.
Action-packed is the only way I can describe this, as we had a stunning move by Piastri to go absolutely nowhere, as he gets shut down by the Ferraris after a way better start than both of them, tries to split them right up the middle, and they both just shut the door on him. A little bit further back, we see Tsunoda get a terrible launch as he immediately loses place to Hamilton, and then Hulkenberg, who started behind Lewis Hamilton, Yuki Tsunoda, and Daniel Ricciardo, flies past Ricciardo and follows Lewis Hamilton past Tsunoda at the very end of turn one, right as they're going at the very, very end of it around the outside of Tsunoda. So Hulkenberg immediately gains those two spots. Both V-carbs fall back. Yuki falls back 2 positions, like I said, to Lewis. And that's quite literally all that happened.
Yeah, it was anticlimactic. And we talk about this in races where the year before there was a big accident or a red flag situation. We always see the following year they take it way more conservatively. Now, of course, we didn't have this race last year in 2023 because of the rain, but the last running of it was 2022. Check out our preview of this race if you want to hear the history a little bit more. But of course, was it Carlos Sainz and Danny Rick?
Yeah, I don't believe that was turn 1. I think that was like turn 4, but yeah, they slammed them right off the track, spun out.
And I think everybody kind of has that in their mind. And so instead of like fighting for positions super aggressively, they kind of just file into that single file line. Let's get through the opening stage of the race. Then we'll figure things out as we go with the tire strategy battle and everything like that. Okay, so, last note I had on the turn one. Did you hear the drivers, the top 3 drivers, when they were in the little break room before going out on the podium talking about the start of the race?
No.
So Max looks over at Charles. Now, Max started in first and Charles started in third, right? And that would be the left lane if you're looking like from the driver's point of view down the track. And Max looks at Charles. He goes, I don't think the left lane is the ideal start lanes for 1 and 3. He's like, I think it should be flipped to give one the better advantage, is what he was hinting at. And that's always made me think, and I guess let us know in the comments if you know more about this. I feel like the F1 grid isn't always laid out to give first place the advantage of the driving line. Maybe these grid positions were established years and years ago when the F1 cars were a little bit different, and now today the cars do something different. But it feels very random how the grids are aligned from race to race.
No, you're right, because the outside line definitely had the advantage going into turn 1. We saw that I mean, that's how Hulkenberg flew past Sonoda, was on that outside line. And honestly, there were some other moves to be made. Like Piastri was going to go around the outside of Sainz, but gets the door shut on him. And it seemed like anybody who had speed on the inside had to immediately get on the brakes because they couldn't shoot to the outside to make an overtake because there was a line of cars there, and they couldn't go forward because the car was right in front of them. So definitely the inside was not the place to be going into turn one.
All right, so a couple of quick hits that I have that don't really tie to strategy or battles, but on lap 8, Verstappen already was up over a 2.5 second lead, and you're like, okay, well, he's pulling away. It's going to be another max day. He eventually built up like a 6 second lead and then like an 8 second lead, all while, of course, the pit stops and tire changes were happening. So you thought Max was running away with it for the majority of the race, I feel like. On lap 8, we see Fernando Alonso enter the pits. Regular pit stop, I guess. He's running back there in the back. Doesn't really matter anymore. But as he comes out of the pit stop, whole front left brake assembly just catches on fire. And now he's got to keep going down the pit lane at like 30 miles an hour with this on fire before he can finally get up to speed and put that thing out.
But the second he gets up to speed, it just immediately goes out. But that whole time he's driving, he's just staring at his front left tire as it's ignited and just a flame coming out of his foot.
So that was fantastic. One lap later, you see Alex Albon pit for some new hard tires. Tire not mounted properly. He's got a wobbly tire going down the track, and he's going all of 8 miles an hour around the Imola circuit trying to keep his tire on his car.
Yeah, you see the engineer try and take a second stab at screwing that on right as the car gets dropped and he gets released. And it's like, oh, too late now.
And it's wobbly. Lap 19 or 20-ish, I didn't get the exact count, but that is where Max Verstappen jumps over that sausage curb chicane that's on the back half of the circuit, and he gets airborne for a good half second.
It's just Red Bull working on their new line of work, Air Verstappen. They're going to come out with planes.
Goodness. They've already got planes. He's going to go fly for them one day and do a skydiving mission into a F1 car or something.
Adrian Newey's working on his new line of work. He's going to work on aircraft from now on.
He's so good at F1 car aerodynamics. What says he can't build a plane? Okay, so that was it for quick hits. Strategy-wise, I thought this point was interesting. On lap 17 is where Perez locks up and goes into the gravel traps, specifically the gravel trap that was brought closer to the track. Now, he ran off a good way, so I think even under the old gravel trap system, he still would have been in it, but he keeps his momentum and he keeps going. But remember, Checo's plan starting in 11th was to run the hards for like 40-something laps, maybe 45 laps, and then come out on some softs to end the race. I think that ruined that plan right there because that gravel just tore up those hard tires, and that's why he went to a medium tire around the 35-ish lap mark instead of running the hards longer.
Well, the worst part about that is that he was actually making ground to Carlos Sainz too, and then it was just immediately all gone.
Yep. Because that gravel just tears you up. Even if it doesn't beat you and end your day, it throws off your strategy quite a bit. Piastri ran a good undercut on the Ferraris, which for the most part worked, right? He ended up finishing in 4th ahead of Carlos, and I think that's all you could ask for. I don't know if you could ask for him to get around Leclerc, but pretty good move by him and McLaren. And I thought it was interesting that Ferrari stayed out the longest of almost all the other teams. Ferrari and Lewis, I believe, were the last to pit all of their drivers. And that might have come back to bite Ferrari in the end, where Leclerc was no longer competitive with Norris.
What's crazy about that, though, I mean, listen to what you just said. We're talking about a team that last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, were the very first team to pit every single race, every single weekend.
Yep. They're changing stuff up. I mean, they're trying to figure out what works, but I think McLaren's strategy was just better for both drivers, honestly. Okay, we're going to get into some battles here. And of course, like I mentioned at the start of this, we'll wrap up with the Norris and Verstappen 15-lap fight to the end. But you did have a couple of other notable battles throughout this race. This race wasn't action-packed with safety. I don't think there wasn't a single yellow flag, was there?
I don't believe so.
Which is odd because I think at the start of the broadcast, they said that Imola's had a 100% hit rate on safety cars.
I don't even think there was a safety car when Albon was going around with a loose tire.
No.
I mean, a yellow flag.
And I I don't recall seeing a yellow flag, but there had to have been a yellow flag, right? In those sectors that he was in?
I would imagine so. I don't recall seeing one, like you said, but I mean, he was getting lapped by the front runners, and it was putting in some dangerous situations where he had to kind of just bring the car to a halt and let the guys go around and then try and jump in between guys to try and get around certain corners. It looked sloppy.
But I didn't see a yellow flag on the screen. There could have been one, but I didn't see one being broadcast. So you had Piastri and Sainz going at it early from like the 4, 5, and 6 spots, wherever they were at the time. And they were going wheel to wheel, and it was Piastri like running up on Carlos with DRS and then Carlos slamming the door. I thought that was a fantastic battle. And it really shows you from like the two, I guess, second drivers on each team, if that's how they're looked at, they can still put up a fight with those cars. Those are two very competent drivers and two very good cars.
That fight was awesome because you had Piastri coming in with him between 3/10 of Carlos Sainz down that long start-finish straight. And then as you're working your way through the entire track, Carlos would build back up to 7/10. And then the start-finish straight, Piastri would get up to 3/10. And then Carlos would wiggle his way back out to 7/10. This went on for like 10 laps, 15 laps.
You had Checo playing the role of slow whoever's behind me down game. 2 instances in this race. On lap 24 and on for a little bit, Norris got held up for like 2 laps behind Checo and just could not get around him. Meanwhile, he's losing ground to Leclerc. He's losing ground to Norris. And so Norris was just fighting to get around Checo, which he eventually did. A little bit later in the race, around lap 30, you had Carlos Sainz pit and come out behind Checo, and then he's stuck behind Checo for like 4 or 5 laps, finally gets the pass on lap 30. And I don't know if just, again, this was a bad setup day for Red Bull and they didn't really nail either of the drivers' car setups, or is Checo starting to fall off? I know one race doesn't tell a story, but Checo was clearly the slowest of like the top 5 or 6 drivers in Imola.
I just think it was bad strategy for Checo's side. For Max's side, I think it was just a bad setup, but we'll get into that in our final 15-lap showdown.
Last note I have is, I have 2 more. Yuki Tsunoda flying around Logan Sargent, and then Nico Hulkenberg doing much the same, and the commentators losing their mind on how clean and quick and good of that racing that was. And I'm like, Logan Sargent isn't really putting up a fight, guys. Like,
no, the much better fight there was Kevin Magnussen making those final 2 passes. I forget who the first one was around, but then he flies around Bottas. He wasn't able to make it into the points, obviously, because he was way back there. But even way back there to still be putting in the fight to get up to 13th, 14th, whatever it was just cool to see you racing at the back.
And then my last note is the Piastri and Leclerc fight, I feel like didn't get a lot of TV coverage. But for a good while there, around the lap 30 mark, they were legit fighting for third. Like Oscar Piastri was fighting for third place.
I will say,
which was wild.
One more note on that Kevin Magnussen thing that I thought was hilarious is I did see the commentators, or did hear the commentators come on and say, you know, a Kevin Magnussen without those points against his record would have made that dive into that corner or something to that effect. And I thought that was hilarious because you know it's true.
He went from an extremely aggressive driver to a very conservative driver overnight.
Hyper conservative.
All right. So Jeremiah, bring us home with the last battle between Norris and Verstappen. This is how we kind of started the episode with we're entering a new era of Formula One. We saw this in the last race with Norris stepping up a little bit, getting his win. We're seeing that again this week. There's now some consistency to it. Walk me through it.
So this was awesome. I mean, I believe anybody and everybody who was watching this was on their feet, especially after what happened in Miami. You had Lando Norris 6 seconds back. About lap 15, you start to see some progress be made. So you're seeing tail of Max's tires starting to go away from him. Lando Norris's lap times are improving over Max's. And so as you progress through these laps, I actually wrote down the times that he gets the different second increments. So 15 laps out, he's 6 seconds back. But as he's picking up pace and Max is losing pace, you get up to 13 laps left. He's now 5 seconds back. So he's taken away a whole second in 2 laps. And you can just tell at this point, the McLaren is cooking. So 10 laps out, he gets to that 4-second mark. So it took him 3 laps that time to get that another second down. That's fine, because within 1 lap, at 9 laps back, he drops down to 3 seconds back. At this point, he is flat out cooking. He is a full second a lap faster than Max. And that continues because as we go partially almost to the end of lap 8, at the end of 8 laps left, going into 7 laps left. He's now at 2 seconds back. And this is where things come to a halt, because this is where I believe that Lando was flat out giving it everything he's got. And the problem with that is, as drivers are driving flat out, the consistency starts to go. And we see this from drivers who may not necessarily be generational talents. I mean, when we hear things like hammer time, that's Lewis saying, okay, I'm going to drive flat out. You know he's not going to make any mistakes. Max Verstappen, when he's flat out, you know he's not going to make any mistakes. The same with Fernando Alonso. And you might go one tier down. That's where you get into like the, say, Charles Leclerc's, the Lando Norris's, where it's one tier down from like next tier generational talent. These are the guys that when they're flat out, you have to be perfect, especially when you're going against a generational talent. So you see Lando Norris flat out. Every now and then, he'll go a little bit too far on a corner or cut in a little too early and ride a bump, and it'll cause him to lose ever so slightly a couple tenths. And at this point, Max is keeping flawless lines. I mean, he is riding with the terrible tires he has, and that's going to hinder his pace. But what he can control is the lines that he takes and his consistency throughout these turns. So you see Max keeping a steady pace, and Lando clearly gaining on him as he goes from 2 seconds back to 1.9, 1.8, 1.7, 1.6, 1.5. Oh, but then there's a slight screw up, jumps back to 1.7. Now he's gnawing at that gap again, 1.6, 1.5, 1.4, slight screw up, back to 1.7. And we see this go on for the next 7 laps. And it isn't until we finally get to the final lap where Lando Norris drops behind a second, or drops back, or comes up to where he's only a second back. And at this point, it's way too late for him to get the start-finish DRS, because he didn't get it until the end, I believe, like turn 1 of the final lap. So he missed out on all that DRS, which he crucially needed to make this final lap. He fights as hard as he can, gets within, I want to say, I think it was half a second, something to that effect, maybe 4 tenths back. I think it was 4 tenths back before Max finally reels in the win. And Lando Norris, unfortunately, is not able to get it done. In the final interviews afterwards, they talk about how Max, or no, on the radio calls, Max was talking about how he had to push harder than he was pushing harder than he's had to this whole season. And then in the final interviews afterwards, they asked Lando, if you had one more lap, do you think you could have got it done? And he said, honestly, I think I could have. And to hear, I mean, Lando was defeated. And the reason why he was defeated, because this is a guy, mind you, that anytime that he's gotten a second place, we hear nothing but woohoo when, everything else coming from him. But this was a guy that was truly defeated. I don't want to say defeated, more like a lack of taste for the position that he got, because now he's tasted it. He's tasted what a victory feels like. And once you have that first victory, there is nothing more that you want. And you could tell it on his face and the way he was expressing himself to his engineers when he came back onto the radio. He wanted that win. And when you're 4 tenths back on the final lap after a 15 lap race or 15 lap final push where you were 6 seconds back and worked your way all the way up to that 4 tenths gap, dude, that is a horrible feeling. And it was all over his face.
And you see that from all those guys you mentioned, Max, Lewis, Fernando, and even, Charles and Carlos and Checo, like the guys that have won races, when they know that they have a car that is capable of winning, which Lando knows that he now has, and they know that they're in position to win and they can't pull it off, it's defeating to them. Like, it's a whole different thing than just getting a whole bunch of, what did Lando have, 14 podiums without a win or 15 podiums without a win?
Yeah, the record.
Yeah, that's like, that was his bar. Like, okay, I can get second or third. Cool. After he got that first win back in Miami, and he's on pace to do it again if he has one more lap and he can't pull it off, it's like, well, man, like, come on now. And I agree. I think if he had one more lap, he would have gotten it. The whole time I'm sitting there watching that battle, he's shaving off like 4 tenths, 5 tenths, sometimes a second off of Verstappen's lead every lap, because they raced like the last 3 laps, I want to say, with Lando within 2 seconds. He shaved it from like 6 seconds down to 2 seconds and then kind of held it between the 1 and 2 second mark for a while. He needed that full last lap under DRS, and he didn't get it, because by the time he crossed the line on the last lap, he wasn't within a second. It was after the first couple of turns, the next DRS detection zone, he got it. So he only got 1 or 2 DRS zones out of it, which wasn't enough. And I think you're right. He was pushing a little too much. Verstappen was running perfect lines. And at one point, Verstappen actually pushed the lead from like 0.3 or 0.4 back up to like 0.9 or 0.8. And I think Lando finished, where did he finish? 0.725 behind Verstappen. But
Okay.
yeah, but he did get within 0.4 at some point, which is right on the back of a guy. If you've seen F1, like between 0.2 and 0.4, depending on the circuit and where you are on it, that's right on a guy. He was right there.
But this is kind of what I meant, though, when I said there's tiers to this. I mean, people say there's levels to this, but there actually is. You have the top tier guys. That's going to be your Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, guys that have gotten the championship done, wrapped up, sealed, and we can see consistency when it's needed most. Lando Norris, when he was flat out, had minor, and I mean ever so slight, minor mistakes. But when you're going against a guy who is putting out flawless laps with the car that with what he's capable with the machinery he has in front of him, and his tires were gone, talking about Max, Lando had to give everything that he had to and could not mess up. I mean, when he was driving without that stressor, when he was still 6 seconds back, he was putting out flawless laps. And that's why we saw the gap go from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. But once he started to taste, I can get this thing done, and he was pushing flat out, that's when you gotta be perfect. And if you're not perfect, unfortunately, this is the result.
Yeah, so Max takes home the win, wins by, like I said, 0.725, which is a very close win for Max, given his history of winning by multiple seconds. And of course, last races, Lando getting the win. Now, of course, Verstappen had some issues throughout the day, but still, a win's a win. So you have Verstappen, Norris, and Leclerc rounds out your top three. McLaren, like I said, man, they are back because Oscar Piastri finishes in a legit fourth all the way around, no question about it. Carlos Sainz coming in fifth. Your two Mercedes drivers hit sixth and seventh, going Hamilton and Russell. Checo moves up 3 spots from 11th, finishing in 8th. Not a great race for him. We won't get into that too much. We think it was a strategy issue. I think he's still a decent driver, but not a good day. Lance Stroll gets some points down in 9th, and Yuki Tsunoda holds on to a top 10 finish for points for the RB team. You did have Alex Albon DNF. He made it back to the pits right after the tire thing, but then later on just went out.
Yeah, I'm not sure why he got called in. I'm not really sure on that one. I guess he was just too far back.
And hey, Logan Sargent finished ahead of 2 race winners in Valtteri Bottas and Fernando Alonso. So his resume only grows, folks.
Yeah, no, but that's fine.
I've got 3 or 4 radio calls, and then we can wrap this up. And one of them you'll have to remind me of. But early on in the race, Carlos Sainz always has some good ones. And he just comes on the radio to his team around lap 7, and he's like, McLaren is fast. As he's battling like Oscar Piastri. And then lap 41, this was when Lando Norris was running ever so slightly slower than Charles Leclerc. And they came on Lando's radio and they're like, Lando, Charles is being told to push. He's trying to push a lot. And Lando just goes, yep, me too. I'm trying. He's just a lot quicker. And what a difference 10 laps makes too, because that was lap 41. And about lap 52 is when Lando really starts putting the heat on Verstappen. 10 laps, Lando goes from not being able to compete with Charles Leclerc to I'm going to go compete with Max Verstappen.
Yeah, wild
change of events. Last one for me is on lap 52, which is Lando's engineers come on and they say, Lando, Verstappen is complaining about, and Lando just cuts him off and he goes, I see. Like he already knows Verstappen is struggling. He doesn't need his engineer telling him that he's struggling. What was the one that you had from Lando?
Oh, man.
The one where he's like, I'm pushing as much as I can, mate. That's fine if you can't remember.
I don't remember what it was. I can't remember.
At some point when Lando was really trying to put the pressure on Verstappen, his engineer came on and said something to the effects of, hey, Lando, we really need you to push right now. And Lando was like, I'm pushing as much as I can, mate.
Oh, he's like, thank you, or something like that.
And thank you. All right, so that is your 2024 Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Quick look at the standing shows that Lando is still in 4th place, but gaining quickly on Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc at this point. He's put a pretty good gap between him and Carlos Sainz down in 5th. The two Mercedes drivers in 7th and 8th. That is going to be a rough year for Toto Wolff if they end up like that. And then looking over at the grander picture of the team standings, Red Bull still ahead with 268, but they are not pulling away as they have in previous seasons, because not only is Max not winning every race, winning most of them, but not every race, but Checo's not getting the consistent top 3 finishes as they might expect. You have Ferrari stealing a couple, you have McLaren stealing a couple. So you have Ferrari only down by about 46 points, and then you have McLaren down from Ferrari by about 60-something points. But that is very reasonable gaps at this point in the season to make up, especially seeing where McLaren's pace is right now with still 2/3 of the season left to go.
I do want to put one final note here, and that's that my predictions for this race, I don't know if you remember, but I had Max, Lando, and Piastri, and I was off by 1 position. Oscar finished 4th.
I had Max, Lando, and Checo. That did not work out. But my wild card, my wild card was so close because I had the Mercedes drivers finishing behind both McLarens and both Ferraris, which wasn't that crazy. So then I added the kicker of finishing behind Fernando Alonso, who finishes in 19th stupid place. So I lost out on my predictions all the way around, but you had a pretty good day. You were off by 1 spot. You flipped 2 drivers and you've got it nailed.
Yeah, and then I had Ricardo finishing 9th, and he finished, I think it was 11th or 12th. So,
yeah,
it is what it is.
All right, let us know in the comments, will Lando Norris propel his way up to 2nd in the standings, or will Ferrari figure things out at the halfway point and hold them off? What do you think?
Guys, if you think that Mercedes has been sandbagging and George Russell is your Grand Prix winner for this next upcoming race in Monaco, I might be there with you.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.